Hold up, bitch. I want you.
Well, you're probably wondering, how did we get here? And to be quite frank, this is not the first time that Nate Diaz has done this. If you look back at his history, obviously there have been plenty of occurrences that this has happened. Obviously, this is a guy that we're looking at right now who sort of takes the smallest infraction as a big victory. And again, that's a talent and an attribute in and of itself. I mean, do you remember when he rocked Leon Edwards, okay, who is the former welterweight champion at the time right now, obviously recently defeated by Bilal Muhammad, but still one of the best in the world. And at that time was on his way to becoming a champion after defeating Nate Diaz. Obviously went on to fight Usman right after. But he has such a serious self-belief that even though he was getting beat all 5 of these rounds, he had one moment where he rocked Leon Edwards and said, you know what? I won this fight. That's how petty Nate Diaz is. And that's just objectively speaking. It's not to hate on him in any kind of capacity. Well, now you're probably wondering, what does that have to do with this and how does this relate? Quite simple. Nate Diaz did this to feel like he won something. Now, I understand that he has beef with these guys, and I'm going to get to the history behind that in a minute. But understand this. Nate Diaz thinks that this is a victory because Nate Diaz views Islam Makhachev and his team as a threat. Okay? Again, it's a combination of two things. You have to understand that. He views them as a threat, but he also understands that doing these small infractions, just like what I mentioned, where he's getting beat for 5 rounds by Leon Edwards, only to come back and have one shot in the entire contest. Okay, that's all that he needed, was that one shot in the entire contest to declare himself as the winner. But the winner of what exactly? The winner of being the guy that will engage in violence first and foremost before anybody else? Maybe. He definitely won that, but understand there is no victory in that in terms of in-cage activity, because that's something that Team Eagle has going on over Nate Diaz. Nate Diaz loses a fight to Jake Paul, no problem. Nate Diaz loses a fight to Leon Edwards, as we've seen, no problem. He loses a fight to Conor McGregor, even though he won the first fight, no problem. He wins a fight against Anthony Pettis, but gets brutally beat up by Jorge Masvidal. He was going to get beat up by Khamzat, but instead they replaced him and got Tony Ferguson against him as a replacement, only for Tony Ferguson to get submitted, which is everything that we would have expected. And Nate Diaz went out as the winner anyway. And he went out as the winner in a way where as if he had beaten Khamzat, even though Khamzat had fought that night against Kevin Holland and beat him convincingly and easily, which we got to think, man, Khamzat would have beaten his butt way even worse than that. Okay, but if you want to know why Nate Diaz did this, it is because of a moral victory that he had sort of made up in his head. I'm going to throw this bottle. I'm going to look like a complete badass. I'm going to look like an absolute man-child while doing it. But that's okay, because I'm going to have the moral victory by the end of all of this. And by the way, this is not the first time that he's done this. So here we are, fight week of UFC 310. what comes is a press conference for UFC 311 and brings Team Eagle into the mix because Islam is here to promote his fight with Arman Sarukian. Omar Nurmagomedov is here to promote his fight against the champion, Marab, which, by the way, I think is going to be a clean sweep, but that's a completely different story and a completely different conversation for another MMA topic and video. But Nate Diaz saw them and he felt that he needed to stand on business. So I need you to understand that. I need you to understand that I'm looking at this from two lenses. I understand that he's looking at it from a lens of this is my enemy. These are the guys that I have to fight. These are the guys that I beef with. And that's another thing. I don't even know if he has any intentions of wanting to fight any of these guys. I'll tell you what, there've been plenty of street fights and altercations where I thought, man, you know what? Nate Diaz would make a good opponent with this guy, make good numbers, and have a good promo. Mayhem Miller was one of them. Mayhem Miller could have fought Nate. Mayhem Miller could have fought Nick at the time that Mayhem Miller sort of entered the UFC, but I think he fought Michael Bisping, and that was that. But nonetheless, other street brawls that the Diaz brothers have gotten into was because of Jason Mayhem Miller. Now, for those of you that don't know anything about Jason Mayhem Miller, let me give you a little bit of a brief introduction. Well, obviously, I did not want to make this conversation about Jason Mayhem Miller to any extent, but I got to be honest, right? He's an interesting character, and it sort of gives you a little bit of a context into this street fight that he had with Nick and Nate Diaz in that infamous Nashville Brawl they had going on. So Mayhem Miller was a host of the town. And what the concept was, whenever they had a bully, they brought him in to fight or spar with these MMA fighters. And if they could last a certain round or a certain amount of time, then they would be compensated money. And if they weren't able to do so, then I don't know, I guess they would give it to the other guy or give it to the bully that was supposed to go in there and fight the MMA fighter, and his victim would be watching on as Mayhem Miller is hosting the whole entire show. So I believe was around from 2009 to 2012. I think, yeah, that's when the show Bully Beatdown had just started and ended, was right around that time. So, yeah, the format obviously was a professional fighter, the MMA fighter, or $10,000 to the bully, so on and so forth. Yeah, I urge you guys to take a look at that. Very good show nonetheless. But anyways, yes, I'm trying to give you guys a context of what MMA looked like. MMA obviously back then looked like a straight up circus, more of a circus than it is now, if you could even imagine that, right? Because we had all types of characters like this. Not only did you have characters like Jason Mayhem Miller, the likes of Kimbo Slice that was around that time, you also had Nate Diaz, obviously was a contender. And as a result of that fight against Jake Shields, he wanted a match. Now, Jake Shields here, Anderson, okay? And this is when this infamous situation had gone. So the date of this time was April 17, 2010. And again, wanted to give you a little bit of that Mayhem Miller tribute back there to sort of give you an idea of what MMA was back then, okay? So obviously it wasn't as mainstream as it is now, but nonetheless it had a certain following, right? And they were trying to get in the good graces of the mainstream, okay? But that wasn't the case. So obviously, following the Jake Shields victory over Dan Henderson, Miller entered the cage unexpectedly during Jake Shields' post-fight interview. So during the interview, what does Miller do? He goes and interrupts Jake Shields and asks, "Hey, where's my rematch, buddy?" And Jake Shields and his associates, by the way, Gilbert Burns was one of those guys, pushed Mayhem Miller away. Melendez, Nick Diaz, Nate Diaz, and other members of the Cesar Gracie Jiu-Jitsu camp attacked Miller, starting a brawl right there. The fight was eventually broken up by officials and Dan Henderson's corners and promoters and the security in that whole entire place in Nashville. And Miller and 5 other participants were given a 3-month suspension and a fine that ranged about $5,000 to $7,000. So not much of a fine back then. I would argue, right? I don't know. Not really. What do you think? Was that a lot or what? No? No, not for today. Not a lot for today's standards, but it was a lot back then. And then considering that MMA fighters at the time really didn't make that much money, right? So next thing you know, one thing led to another. This is what we got in that whole entire situation. So following the events of the Nashville Brawl, Miller expressed interest in fighting Nick Diaz. And again, a fight that never happened. And why am I bringing this up? Because once again, Nick and Nate are doing exactly this. They're picking fights with people they know that they're not going to fight, but for whatever reason is going to create a big buzz outside of the cage by fighting them. But Nick Diaz and Miller would have been great money. The 170-pound Diaz refused, stating he was a Strikeforce welterweight champion and needed to continue fighting people his weight. So he requested Miller to move down to 170 to fight him. And by the way, Miller did fight at 170 back in the day. So Miller continued to attempt a setup fight, offering a 185 catch weight. And by the way, I believe that is the weight that Diaz and Anderson Silva fought in. But then eventually Diaz fought Anderson Silva at 185. He didn't do too bad, actually. Diaz countered an offer of a 181 catch weight. Strikeforce CEO Scott Croker expressed interest in scheduling his fight, but was unable to because Strikeforce got acquired by Zuffa in the UFC, and then that's how Miller got signed. But yeah, not to make this about Miller in any kind of way, but obviously it was an important part of Nick and Nate Diaz's life, and it kind of shows you where they are, right? And what they're willing to do if you put them in certain situations like this. Now, they obviously felt threatened by Mayhem Miller in some kind of way. I don't know why, or maybe they just did that because there was just a lot of testosterone roaming in the room. But anyways, not the first time that they've done that. Now, going back to the New Orleans Misfits boxing card, okay, where Nate Diaz throws a bottle at one of the influencer boxers. Gets into a situation there outside, the same thing. Guess what happens? Speaking of influencers, how about that Logan Paul lookalike? He puts him in a guillotine choke, then drops his head on the floor, which, by the way, is extremely dangerous because he could have unalived him, do all types of worse things to him. And by the way, how about the Conor McGregor fight, the rematch they had in UFC 202? He didn't want to stay there any longer. Conor obviously was really sharp with the tongue back in the days. Nate Diaz, not so much. I mean, he was never really that sharp in the tongue. He is an exciting personality, a must-see TV type of character, but he was never a trash talker in any kind of way. And even for Conor McGregor himself, all of that kind of deteriorated along with his fighting skills as well. But nevertheless, Nate Diaz walks out and he gives Conor McGregor the finger. And what does Conor McGregor do as a result of that? He goes and throws a bottle at Nate Diaz, and then he throws a bottle back, and then they go back and forth. And then how about that the PFL? Nate Diaz and Khabib were at the PFL along with his team. They got into it there. They got into a scuffle, which ultimately is what led up to all of this situation going on right now. So it's just Nate Diaz standing on business by the end of the day. And I want to bring up some nuances about that because I think it's really important to sort of understand the full scope of what's going on here. Okay. I want you to understand that I'm looking at this from two different lenses. Number one, I'm looking at it from the lens of how immature and how man child like behavior this is from Nate Diaz. And by the way, even though I have that particular caption on the thumbnail, I'm telling you that I don't necessarily really believe that. But why am I saying it? Because there's a lot of people out there that will call him a man child. But do I have a different opinion on this matter? As a matter of fact, I do. My opinion on this matter is that whether I like it or not, obviously, you know that I am a big supporter of Khabib Islam and his whole entire team. But to be unbiased about this whole situation, I'm just going to call it right down the middle and say that Nate was standing on business. And that's the way that I perceive it, as somebody that understands the mentality of the streets, somebody that understands the ethos of what it means to never back down and stand on business. That's all Nate is doing on protocol. He's standing on those principles. So I can't really fault him for taking that type of initiative. But at the same time, why is it that a lot of people out there view what Nate Diaz did as man child immature like behavior? Well, here's the thing, right? Most guys, whenever they're challenged, especially if they have a very fiery personality, straight away they're going to go and respond in a very harsh manner against that person. They're going to attack them. They're going to verbalize it or maybe even do it into physical form, whatever that may be. Whether that would be throwing a bottle, getting into a little bit of a fade, getting into a scuffle, a little dust up, knuckle up, or other worse things, such as things that I'd rather not mention due to monetization processes of YouTube. But on any regard, those are the options that you have. You got to stand on business. But at the same time, you also got to understand this, right? You remember that story that I was covering about Wack 100 and Blue Devil, right? The way that everybody looked at Blue Devil in this whole situation, they looked at him as somebody that sort of got punked in this entire matter. Okay. I urge you guys to take a look at this story that I'm talking about because I like to talk to people like as if they don't know the story. If you often notice, a lot of YouTubers, when they go on their videos and they go on their content, what they do is explain things as if you already know them. And quite frankly, maybe you should if you have an IQ that's above 90. I would assume that you understand you can sort of look these things up. But either way, what's interesting about Blue Devil and Wack 100, right? A lot of people are saying that he punked Blue Devil because Blue Devil didn't really say anything after Wack 100 was berating him over snitching allegations and then yelled at him, talked bad about his neighborhood, talked bad about his family, and then he just sat there and did nothing. Well, that's one perception of it. The other perception is, you know what? You don't know what is going on behind closed doors. And we're just going off of the perception that a lot of people have. And by the way, this sort of falls into the narrative that I was spewing earlier about people taking minuscule wins like this as the biggest thing in the world. Because that's Nick and Nate Diaz in a nutshell. Whenever they do something to you, the minute they slap you, that is a win to them. They think it is a knockout blow. Oh, I slapped you, so I won. That's basically what Wack 100 did to Blue Devil. He smacked him up one time and believed that he won. All because he just stood there and yelled at him. And by the way, it wasn't even in a physical form. It was done online. So that's another factor that you got to take into the consideration of this entire matter at hand as well. But either way, a lot of you are going to call Nick Diaz and Nate Diaz a man-child for behaving in this kind of matter. And then there are some out there like myself who are going to perceive this as just standing on business by the end of the day. So I like standing on business with my content. Don't forget to like and subscribe. That is all that I have for you in this particular matter, in this particular story. Enjoy the fights, enjoy your life, enjoy and love everyone around you, and be safe. And may Allah bless everybody. Inshallah.